Hi everybody, this is John Sneisen here from World Alternative Media, and I'm in beautiful Phoenix, Arizona, where we are attending a Freedom Force International Congress that we're going to talk about global warming and inconvenient truth. And right now I'm here and I'm very proud of this to present to you Lord Christopher Monckton, someone who has told the truth for many years in the face of cult-like group and faculty signs and state worshippers. So I want to thank you, Mr. Monckton, for joining our channel.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and a pleasure to be here in Phoenix, Arizona, where the sun shines. And in Britain, we don't see the sun very much at this time of year, or at any time of year.
Yeah. Now, over time, Monckton, you have done a lot of research, and I had the honor to speak with you at breakfast this morning and get to learn a little bit about what you've been up to. Now, with the United Nations and countless countries around the world pushing policies of depopulation, extortion in the face of what they call climate change, can you explain how people have been deceived and what the goal of the global establishment in deceiving the people is?
The first thing to understand about the climate issue is that although it is a scientific issue and an economic one, it is also a moral one. And I want to start there, because there are 1.2 billion people in the world who don't have any access to electricity.
Yeah.
And that means that approximately 1 million of those every month are dying before their time because they don't have cheap, baseload, affordable, reliable, continuous, easily maintainable electricity. And of course, that really means coal-fired electricity.
Yeah.
Coal-fired electricity emits to the air twice as much carbon dioxide per unit generated as natural gas does, but it's also half the price. And the technology for combustion of coal, even with the modern filtering systems, the fluidized bed, the high temperature combustion, the extra lining in the boilers so that the only thermal heat loss is 0.5% through conductivity through the wall of the boiler. You've got these very efficient systems. You have flue gas scrubbing, you have fly ash trapping. If you use all these things, and these are all relatively low-tech systems, then these are systems of generation which third world countries can relatively easily maintain. It's not just a question of giving them electricity, but making sure that once you've given it to them, they can maintain it. You give them windmills or solar panels, they'll break down and they won't be able to fix them. Yeah. And they won't be able to maintain them. Coal-fired power is relatively easy to use, and they can maintain that much more easily. So the campaign by the international governing class, with the UN right there in the mix, to prevent the spread of coal-fired electricity to countries who desperately need it, has the direct and immediate effect of killing a holocaust of our fellow citizens of this planet every 6 months. That's how murderous it is to deny people electricity, when it is easily within the reach of the international community to give them electricity. After all, it's been reasonably reliably costed that compliance with the Paris Agreement, or with the various national undertakings given under that agreement, which itself doesn't require any particular commitment to be given, but those commitments that have been given will cost between $1 and $2 trillion a year, and all to address what, as we'll go on to see, is a non-problem based on a mathematical error and a misunderstanding of economics.
Right.
But in the meantime, the immediate effect of denying these countries that need it electricity that is coal-fired and therefore cheap, at a levelized cost of approximately $20 or $30 a megawatt hour. That's the cheapest form of electricity there is. That's what poor countries need, and they need it now. And for every year that the international community spends its time diverting attention from that problem and wasting its time on climate change, the international community and the United Nations are killing by neglect and by indifference something like 12 million of the people who they are supposed to protect. And they're doing this in the name of a problem which, even if it were a problem, would not really become much of a problem for approximately 100 years.
Yeah, 12 million people, that is...
per year.
Yeah, it's an insane number. That's human beings like you and me dying because they're not willing to...
It's
like
about
they're pushing an agenda.
0.1% of the 1.2 billion every year.
So that it almost sounds like a little bit of a depopulation going on right there.
Well, the sad truth is that it actually has the reverse effect. If you deny electricity, and hence clean water supply, and hence sewerage, all of which depend on electricity to drive the pumps, etc. If you deny electricity to people, you deny them hospitals, you deny them medical care, and so on. Paradoxically, although more of them die, far more of them will also be born. The birth rate will always exceed the death rate. And the reason for this is that because this is a tough planet to survive on, it always has been. I mean, if you go back 70 million years, you're too young to remember, but at that time there was an enormous volcanic eruption, and it wiped out, it was right in Java somewhere, and it wiped out all but 5,000 human beings on the planet.
Yeah, exactly.
Who were living in caves in various places. How do we know it was 5,000? We do analysis of the mitochondrial DNA, which is a rather spooky kind of DNA. It's not the same as your own DNA, but it's in the walls of your cells. And this mitochondrial DNA, much older, much simpler, is very much easier for us to make genetic tracings with. And we have found that 70 million years ago, all the different people who evolved in the world, they came from 5,000 people who managed to survive this cataclysm 70 million years ago. As a result of this, we have evolved so as to withstand disasters by increasing our fertility automatically when times are tough and we are poor and we don't have enough to eat or drink.
Gotcha.
And so what is happening in the poorer countries is that enormous numbers of people are dying, but even more people are being born, and the misery that results from this means that you then get overpopulation, not because we are making people prosperous, but because we're keeping them poor. It's the poorer countries that breed faster, and it's the richer countries in which, were it not for net immigration, the population would now be falling like a stone. So the moral imperative, the first duty of the international community, is to these two holocausts of innocent people every year who are being killed well before their time because they don't have the comforts and the health-giving properties of electricity available to them as we have. This needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed now, and we can't get them to fix it until we can get them off their present fixation with this global warming nonsense, which we ought now to get onto.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's very interesting. So when it comes to global warming, we've seen, first they were talking about global warming back in the 30s. I remember seeing articles from Svalbard, where up in Norway, where they were looking at glaciers melting and so on in the 30s. Then there was a fear of global cooling again, then global warming again, and now they changed it to climate change. Why can't these people make up their minds, and what does it say for their fear-mongering, and why can't they develop a
What one
clear
has to do
message?
is to look at the history of what happened. The Berlin Wall came down, and Soviet international socialist communism collapsed worldwide. Yes, there were a few outposts like the miserable Cuba of Castro, and the miserable North Vietnam, and the miserable North Korea, and the miserable China, which retain this dictatorial, totalitarian, left-wing system. But the Russian version of it, which was at that time, the much more internationally outward-looking form, which was trying to drag down the United States and Britain and Europe to the low, miserable level of existence which communism had achieved in Russia itself. That finally collapsed because Russians began to realize that life was better just about everywhere else on the planet than under Soviet-style communism.
Yeah, exactly.
And the communists in the West who had supported Russia were furious at this. I remember a few weeks after the Berlin Wall came down being visited by a sociology lecturer from Leeds, whom I'd known when I'd been on the Yorkshire Post. He came down to see me in London, where I was managing editor of the Telegraph magazine at that time. And he came into my office and he said what a sad thing it was that communism had collapsed. I said, this is so out of date. It's so yesterday. I said, these days have gone. And he couldn't change gear mentally.
Yeah.
And so what they then did, these people that were cut adrift, they had to find some other way of getting communism to infect Western societies and destroy their economic systems. They had failed by means of Soviet communism, so then all the communists piled into the environmental movement. The go-to guy on this is, of course, Patrick Moore, who is a doctor of science himself and was the founder of Greenpeace. Now, at the time when Patrick Moore founded Greenpeace, it was a genuine environmental organisation which had a number of victories. It managed to prevent the extinction of whales worldwide, managed to prevent seal clubbing, or at least limit it. They were addressing real environmental issues. But then in moved the communists, out from the Berlin Wall and straight into the environmental movement. They took over Greenpeace, and he had to leave because he wasn't a communist. He wasn't any kind of a politician. He was neither left nor right. His concern was the environment. And their concern was not the environment. Their concern was to use the environment as a fig leaf to conceal the crudity of their intention, which was to continue the work of Russian communism in destroying the Western world. Now, is this to say that every environmentalist or every member of Greenpeace is therefore a covert Soviet communist? Of course not.
No.
What we are saying is that there's an awful lot of people in Greenpeace who naively think that organisation is an environmental organisation, when in fact it's an environmentalist organisation. It is a communist organisation now, which is pursuing a thoroughly nasty agenda, which is deeply inimical to the freedom, prosperity, the liberty of the West. And it should be, in my view, declared illegal and shut down, and all its leaders, who know perfectly well what kind of an organisation it is, should be imprisoned for a very long time, because, I think, under the International Criminal Court Code, because what they are doing is killing a Holocaust every 6 months as a direct result of the policies they follow, policies which they know, above all else, they know will have exactly this effect of causing widespread death and at the same time causing widespread increase in fertility and birth rate in poorer countries that don't have electricity, leading in the end directly to a far larger environmental footprint of mankind than if my policy of giving everyone that needs it coal-fired electricity as fast as possible would have. Our impact on the environment would be far less than what is already happening as a result of their policies. So again, the moral issue arises, as does the scientific one, because the question is this: if they were justified in saying that global warming is a real problem caused by our putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, if that was a real problem, even then you would have to do an appropriate calculation, an economic calculation, to try to determine whether it was an economically more rational choice to try to prevent global warming today at huge cost, we know it's at huge cost now, or to let it happen, even at the exaggerated rates they predict, and adapt to its adverse consequences. And I was the first person to combine the official equations of climate sensitivity, which is how much warming you're going to get, that they use, with the standard equations of intertemporal investment, appraisal and economics, to demonstrate that even if they were right about how much global warming we are going to get, and we'll come on to that a bit later on, they are still wrong about whether it's economically rational or desirable to do anything about it, because it is between 10 and 100 times costlier to spend 1 or 2 trillion a year today under the Paris Agreement to try to make virtually non-existent global warming go away than it is just to let it happen and pay the far later and far lesser cost of adapting to its net adverse consequences. So on the economic side, as well as on the moral side, they are in the wrong. Then we come to the scientific side. And what is interesting is that on the economic side and on the moral side, they're kind of willing still to have some kind of a debate. But on the scientific side, they're not. They say the science is settled, and there's a consensus, and it's 97%. And that was the moment at which I began to realize they were talking nonsense, because broadly I'd gone along with what I was told the consensus was, until they started saying you have to believe it because there is a consensus.
Yeah.
And I, as a classicist, studied, among other things, Aristotle. And 2,350 years ago, he published the Refutations of the Sophists. They were the bullshit merchants of their day. And he used to have great arguments with them. And he noticed that they were using the same kind of bogus arguments, all of them, and he was rather intrigued by this. It was as though there was some controlling mind, except that they were using these arguments from a variety of different countries in a variety of different ways, but they were the same kind of bogus arguments. So he categorized them, and he called them fallacies. And so these, well, he called them the Greek word for fallacies, but that he first drew the world's attention to the concept of a species of argument which is a priori incapable of leading to any conclusion that you can believe in. You can't tell whether the conclusion is right or not because the argument itself is invalid. It is not entailed by its premises. And so he categorized these, and not the least of these forms of argument that he said were just bogus a priori was the argument from head count, which the medieval schoolmen would later call the argumentum ad populum, the argument from just counting heads among the people. You know, the majority is how you decide your science. Well, no, that's not how science is done. That is a logical fallacy. To argue from consensus is simply wrong, because even if there were a consensus, which, as I shall reveal in a moment, there isn't, it would still be you still couldn't tell whether the consensus was right just because a whole lot of people, you are told, happen to adhere to that consensus. But then they go on and they say, oh, but you see, it's a consensus of experts. But then that's another logical fallacy, also codified by Aristotle 2,350 years ago. And that one is what the medieval schoolmen were later to call the argumentum ad verecundiam, the argument from reputation or from appeal to authority. Just because people have fancy names and degrees behind their name doesn't mean that what they're telling you is right,
very, very
even
true.
if lots of them tell you it's right. In the end, the only way to find out whether they're telling the truth is to examine the evidence and the data directly. There is no easy way. But the left have invented this consensus which doesn't in fact exist. How do I know? Well, because about 3 years ago in Australia, some fascist climate campaigners, the lead author of this particular paper actually goes around dressed in Nazi uniform. Real extremists, they're fascists, they call themselves left-wing. Of course, fascism is very left-wing. It's even more left-wing than communism. It's really extreme, and these people are fascists. And they produced a paper in which they said that of 11,944 papers on climate and related topics published in the 21 years 1991 to 2011, 97.1% had actually stated that most of the global warming since 1950 was attributable to our emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. In other words, recent warming was mostly man-made. That, they said, was the consensus proposition. And before we get on to examining their numbers, let's just say that if that is all the consensus proposition is, it's a pretty milk and water consensus. You'll notice the word dangerous doesn't occur in it anywhere. There's nothing about whether this warming will be dangerous or even detrimental in any sense. All that the consensus is said to say, 97% of them, is that most of the warming since 1950 was man-made. That may or may not be true. The true scientific position is actually that we haven't a clue. We simply can't tell. So when we analysed their list of 11,944 papers, which they produced with very bad grace, only after they'd got weeks of worldwide publicity for the consensus is now clear, science is settled, the argument's closed, now we must act. That was the line they were peddling. Only 3 weeks later were they willing, after a considerable pressure from me, to release the data file listing not only all 11,944 papers they said they'd looked at, but also how they had marked each one. And they had put a little figure 1 against each of the papers that had actually stated what they said that 97.1% of them had stated, that recent warming was mostly man-made, or words to that effect. And guess how many of those 11,944 papers actually said what they said they said?
No, how many was that?
It was 64.
64, wow.
That was their marking, remember. They
Yeah,
had said
yeah.
that only 64, and they reported this 0.5% consensus as 97.1.
That
It
is
was
a crazy
straight
number.
lie.
Wow. Yeah.
It was a fraud. In fact, it's being investigated at the moment by the Queensland Police, and they have already determined that a deception was conducted by the people who wrote this paper, and they're at the moment investigating whether, under the law of Australia, they can prosecute for a fraud without being able to quantify precisely the extent of the losses that this monstrous fraud has caused. They accept the losses are large, they accept the
Yeah.
damage done by this lie is considerable, but they're not yet sure that they can actually prosecute.
Gotcha.
But they are looking at it, and pressure is eventually going to be put on them to make sure that they do their job. It's a very serious criminal offence,
That's
has
huge.
been committed
Yeah.
by the authors of that paper. So we then wrote our own paper setting out the true numbers, because we read the 64 papers that they said had
Yeah.
said that most of the recent ones. And we found that only 41 of those actually said it. So the consensus,
Wow.
even on this milk and water
Yeah.
proposition that most of the warming since 1950 was man-made, which may or may not be true, that consensus proposition, milk and water as it is, only 0.3% of published papers in the scientific literature explicitly
is-
state their agreement with that consensus.
That is a mind-blowing
And you
number.
cannot spin it up to 97.1% by any legitimate means.
Wow.
And so let's deal with that
Yep.
very firmly. And the extraordinary thing is that although the paper that said there was a 97% consensus is still quoted daily in news bulletins by politicians,
Oh yeah, I see it on TV.
whole
everywhere.
time,
Yeah.
97%, 97%, 97%. The countervailing paper published by us, which completely destroys them by simply saying they themselves did not find 97%, they only found 0.5, and they actually should have found 0.3. That paper has also been peer reviewed and published. It was published later the same year, and yet you probably never heard of it, because
Yeah,
the
yeah.
media will not give both sides of the story, and in particular they will shy away from anything that smells in the least bit like the truth.
Yeah.
And this
it's
is a very
so true,
extraordinary
yeah.
thing. It's
Yeah.
very sad.
Yeah.
And of course the news media, as well, all the electronic media, other than, say, Fox News here in the United States, are plummeting in their revenues. Fox News
Oh.
has just had yet another massive increase in its ratings. It
mainstream,
now accounts
yeah.
for well over half of all the 24-hour news audience. I've been glued to it for the last few days since I
Yeah.
came here. And yet even they will not really get to grips with this climate question. It's too difficult. They don't want to do the homework.
Yeah.
And so even they haven't really said, look, this is basically pants, and we're going to expose it, and we're going to allow the skeptics to have a voice on this, as they've allowed the skeptics on other left-wing projects
Yeah.
to have a voice. They still haven't got round to it on Fox News, to doing the climate properly. And so we have to call them out for that
Yeah.
and say, come on,
Totally.
Fox, you're wonderful, but you're not wonderful enough.
No.
Please deal with this climate
time to
thing.
look at the
and
truth.
Here, the leading scientists who are saying that actually this has been badly over-egged, and they can produce arguments just as I have on the consensus part, which are completely definitive. The other side have not been able to come back and say, well, of course, there really is a 97% consensus. Monckton is just wrong. They can't do that because they know Monckton is right.
Yeah.
And so they just go quiet, and they go on reciting their lie. And the media, they can trust them. Even Fox News won't get out of bed to report the truth on this consensus question. So then we move on from consensus, which we have now said, not only, even if there were a consensus, it wouldn't matter because that's not how science is done. The consensus could still be wrong. But also, the science which the consensus is said to adhere to, even though the consensus proposition as defined in their paper didn't mention the science, it just mentioned how much warming it had.
Yeah.
But we're told there's a consensus on the science, though there's never been any proper survey to establish whether there is. And even if there were, it doesn't matter. But actually on the science, the so-called consensus is wrong. They screwed up.
Yeah.
And I have known, since I first was invited by a hedge fund, a boutique hedge fund in London, and the chief executive got in touch. He said, please can you spend a month on this and let me know what you think. So I did a report, 80 pages long, in which I said, they have over-egged the pudding, that much we know. And I said, I can't yet quite pin down, but I'm worried about what are called temperature feedbacks. See, there's only 1 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2 caused directly by the CO2.
Yeah.
The rest is caused by what are called temperature feedbacks, which are supposed in the official theory to amplify the original warming. Now, I could see that the way they were doing that just looked weird. It was producing results that did not seem consistent with the astonishing stability of the climate over the last 800,000 years. How can we tell what the temperature was going back that far? You can take isotopes of oxygen. There are 2 different isotopes. The normal isotope is oxygen 16, but there's also oxygen 18. And the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in air trapped in Arctic ice and firn as the snow falls on it and packs it down. And then you can look, and you can go down hundreds of thousands of years with this record, just from the ice strata. We can tell from that ratio of the 2 isotopes at what temperature that air became locked into the ice. So you can reconstruct, long before anyone had thermometers, you can reconstruct roughly what happened. It's a slightly inexact time, roughly what happened to global temperature. And the extraordinary thing is that the variance either side of the period mean over those 810,000 years for which we have this record is only 3 to 3 1/4 Celsius. It's tiny.
Wow, that is crazy. Yeah,
so it's hardly changed. Now, why is this? The reason, of course, is that there are enormous thermostatic properties of the climate, not the least of which is that the climatically active region of the atmosphere is sandwiched between 2 enormous heat sinks. One of them is called outer space, and for all intents and purposes that's an infinite heat sink. And then down here there's the ocean, which has such a vast heat capacity that it too might as well be regarded as having a near infinite heat sink, because it can just take so much warming from the atmosphere and it simply won't work up a sweat itself. So because of these very powerful thermostatic properties of the boundaries of the atmosphere, the ocean below and outer space above, you would not intuitively expect this to be a climate in which temperature feedbacks would hugely amplify any direct original warming. And so I smelt a rat the moment when I realized that 2/3 of all the warming they were predicting as their central estimate was coming from these feedbacks. And the more extreme papers, actually it was 9/10 was coming from these feedbacks. And yet here was a climate which, from the measurements we were able to make in Antarctica, has remained eerily stable as far as temperature is concerned. I mean, of course, a swing of 6 degrees Celsius between the bottom of the ice ages when it's 6 degrees down, and then to the peak of the interglacial warm periods, like between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, when it was probably a couple of Celsius warmer worldwide than it is today. That's enough to go from ice ages to a kind of hothouse Earth. Yeah. But it isn't enough to posit the existence of enormously influential feedbacks. Yet that is what they try to do. Yep. So I and my team have been looking for this error. I've been looking for it for 11 years now. And a few weeks ago I found it. And at the conference that I'm attending here, the Freedom Force Congress, I'm going to announce what it is, and I can give you an outline of it now. Yep. The feedback loop comes originally from electronic circuitry. That's where all the mathematics of feedbacks were worked out, because you could take measurements at the nodes, the junctions of the wires in the feedback loop, the input and the output nodes in particular, to tell exactly what the feedback characteristics of the circuit were and how much amplification you were achieving. And so the theory of feedbacks in dynamical systems, not just electronic circuits, but the climate is another dynamical system. It changes over time. Yeah. Feedback mathematics is applicable to dynamical systems, provided you do it right. And how do we know how to do it right? We go back to the electronic circuits where it was originally worked out. People like R.S. Black in 1927, who first worked out the concept of negative feedback while sitting on the Lackawanna ferry on his way to work. And he scribbled it down on a piece of newspaper that he had with him. And they've still got that newspaper at Bell Labs. They're very proud of it.
Oh, well.
And so this was all to do with electronic circuits.
Yeah.
Then the great textbook of this was written by H.W. Bode, Henrik W. Bode, in 1945, and it's gone through numerous editions since, constantly updated. It's the classic work on how you do feedbacks. Chapter 3 is the chapter where it explains in very simple terms the elements of feedback analysis. And the moment I read that chapter, because somebody had said to me, they are doing it wrong, and he had found a way in which they were doing it wrong, didn't make any difference. I read the chapter, and I realized they were doing it wrong, but in a way far bigger than he had spotted. And so I then had a look at this, and I realized what they were doing was, instead of feeding into the feedback loop not only the small change of 1 Celsius in temperature, but also added to that the existing absolute temperature of around 255 Kelvin. If you don't add those two together before you feed them in, if you only use that 1 Celsius instead of the 256 Celsius you should be feeding in, it's going to lead to quite a large error. But only in certain circumstances. And this is why, for at least 30 years since this error was first made, it dates back to the mid-80s, a third of a century ago, this error has gone undetected, because people could say to themselves, if you choose a particular value for what's called the feedback factor, and then you do this calculation, you can do it either by using the full absolute temperature, and then you get a full absolute temperature. At the other end you subtract the two to get the change. Or you can do it as just the change in temperature getting put in before feedbacks, and then you see what the change in temperature the other end is. And you can do the calculation either way, and you get the same answer. And that's why people think, well, there isn't any error here. But there is.
Yeah.
And the error comes not in the central estimate so much. It comes in what are called the upper and lower bounds of the temperature change you expect. And this variation away from the central estimate of how much warming we're going to get arises solely because of uncertainty as to the value of the feedback factor. And so if you start with their central estimate, this is what we do in the scientific paper we've just submitted to a journal. If you take their estimate, their central estimate of the magnitude of the feedback factor, and you then use their standard deviations of around 40% up or down on that central estimate, and then you recalculate, then you do get differences, and very large ones, between what their figures show and what our figures show. And that is at the bounds rather than at the central estimate. That's where the error is. And the error is far bigger at the upper bound than it is at the lower bound, because the curve of the temperature response to feedbacks is not linear. It is rectangular hyperbolic. And I used to study the conic sections and hyperbole and parabole and ellipses when I was at Cambridge, because I was a classical architect, and you had to understand how the mathematics of these things worked. They were all worked out originally by I think Arabic mathematicians, but then they were studied in particular by Menaichmus of Alapekonissos in Asia Minor in around 340 BC, and he published a paper on it in which he used the intersection of the rectangular hyperbola with the parabola to determine the answer to one of the longest standing problems in ancient mathematics, which was the problem of the duplication of the cube. If you have a cube of side length 1, let us say, and then you want to have 2 cubes whose volumes add up to the volume of the cube of side length 1, what's the answer? And until they did this very clever thing with the intersection of the two curves, nobody had ever known what the answer was, and he was able to determine quite precisely what it was by using these curves. So I, having had a background in classical mathematics, it was part of my course at Cambridge, I got to understand all this. I had a special lecture in it, because I was clearly interested in it, by Professor Hugh Plummer, who taught me all of this. He sat down one day and he said, "You don't know about the conic sections, do you?" And he sat down and did all the mathematics for me. I was riveted by this. And so then when I saw this curve appearing in scientific papers, I then calculated it myself, the curve of the temperature response in the presence of various values of feedback. I realized that it was a rectangular hyperbola. I knew the characteristics of that curve. And so for a long time I've known they've got this wrong, but I didn't know exactly what they'd done wrong until really only a few weeks ago. So now we've drafted the paper, we've submitted it for publication, and that was 3 weeks ago. They throw it back within a week if it's complete rubbish. So we know we've got past the first hurdle. The editors realize they can't immediately dismiss it, and so they have put it out for review. And we just have to wait now, and we're expecting an enormously fierce round of review because, of course, scientists around the world are making their fortunes at taxpayers' expense, telling us that this is all gloom and doom, it's all terrible, and you could have this enormous warming of 10 or 12 Celsius per doubling of CO2. Well, we can now prove that is not the case. The central estimate of warming...
The smoking gun.
Is perhaps 2 Celsius, and maybe it's just less than half a Celsius either side of that. This is not actually a very big deal, and that's before you start looking at other errors which other scientists are looking at in that central estimate. And for instance, if you take the error identified by Professor Will Happer, who will be speaking here today, not here today, but later this week at the conference I'm attending, he will be saying, as he did to the World Federation of Scientists meeting in Erice in Sicily 2 years ago, that the extent, the size of the CO2 forcing, the change in temperature that's likely to drive, has been overestimated at the central estimate by 40%. And that means applying our formula that the bounds are only 0.3 Celsius either side of the 1.6 Celsius, which is where he would put the central estimate on global warming. So you can see we're now looking at less than 2 Celsius of global warming, even at the high-end estimate. And that's the value of our research. It constrains the high-end estimate in particular to take away this alarming prospect of tipping points and so on. And of course, before we dared to send this to the very distinguished journal that we sent it to, we wanted to get it read by people who knew their stuff. So I sent it to Will Happer, because he's the foremost practicing physicist in the world today, the Cyrus Fogg Brackett Professor of Physics at Princeton. I mean, he is not stupid. He read it. He said it's far too long and complicated. So we rewrote it and shortened it and tightened it. He said, yes, I like this paper, he said. He saw that we'd got it right. So then I sent it also to Professor Ray Bates. Now, Ray is the world's greatest expert, recognized on both sides, in the application of feedback mathematics to the climate. He's written dozens of papers on it. And, his mathematics is kind of way, way, way beyond mine. He's a very, very, very clever man. And I debated this issue with him in front of the Law Society of Ireland 3 years ago. And he went white when he saw this graph of this hyperbola, because he'd not seen the full graph before. I'd sat down and calculated it. And so he wrote to me after that debate. He said, actually, there's clearly something wrong here. I'm going to have to go back and have a look at it. He spent 3 years doing this, and he wrote a paper earlier this year coming to a conclusion similar to mine, but from a completely different direction. He hadn't identified this error, but he had realized that nevertheless the climate sensitivity, the amount of warming that you get per doubling of CO2, was far too high in the complex models, because he had built his own simple model to demonstrate that this was exaggerated. So that was published after very fierce peer review, because again, the other side don't want the truth to be published, earlier this year. And so if we come out now showing that it's not just that the climate sensitivity estimates have been exaggerated, but they've been exaggerated because they've made an identifiable, serious, significant error, that we think, provided we can get anyone to publicize it once we've got it through peer review and published, that we think ought, in any rational world, to bring the climate scare to an end.
Well, that is huge news, Mr. Monckton, because this agenda has been pushed for a very long time, and of course you had the Agenda 21 and now the new Paris Agreement with Agenda 2030 that they all put it in, and that's all they push. Like, they push that whole idea that we're gonna have that hyperbolic global warming if we don't stop, and you debunked it almost.
Well, we have yet to see, because really the way science works is that even though I think our result is definitive, because it's very clear that they are not using the feedback mathematics as it should correctly be used, it may be that I've misunderstood something. I'm a layman after all. It may be that all the people we've sent it to for review have misunderstood something, even though they're the most eminent scientists on the planet in this field. We may all be wrong. And perhaps the so-called international community is right. But at the moment I don't think so. But the only way we'll know for sure is once the paper has survived peer review, if it survives peer review, and then once it gets published, whether it survives the scrutiny of the international community. And now, of course, they won't want this to be right. They've got careers, they've got fortunes invested in their storyline.
Billions will be lost for them.
Trillions.
Trillions.
Trillions now it is. Serious money, a trillion here, a trillion there, and soon you're talking really serious money, and at the expense of general taxpayers. And it's essentially a fraud, because they're all saying the science is settled, and if we're right, then everyone who said the science is settled was committing a fraud. Now you may say, but if they didn't know it was settled, how can you say it's a fraud? Well, the way the fraud law works is that if you say you know a thing is so, and you know it isn't so, that's a fraud.
No.
If you say a thing is so, and you don't know whether it's so or not, that's just as big a fraud.
Yeah, exactly.
And they've all been saying the science is settled, when actually the science they thought was settled was wrong. It is indeed settled, but in a direction quite unexpected, quite different from what they thought. And strictly speaking, what should happen if we are proven right is that a lot of senior scientists and senior scientific organizations should be sent to jail or given very heavy fines because of the criminal corruption by which they told us the science was settled, and they told us this problem was huge, when it actually isn't huge. At the very worst, we'll get a small warming, and this is not a devastating event. The idea that there's some kind of ideal temperature, and that a tiny fraction either side of that and the whole world goes to hell in a handcart, is nonsense. True, if temperature were to fall by a couple of degrees Celsius worldwide, then you might be heading back towards an ice age. That would kill a lot of people.
Yeah, that would be tough.
But if it goes the other way, and you get 2 or even 3 or 4 degrees of warming over the next 200 or 300 years, is this going to do any harm? Basically, no. This is the truth of it. It's the other way. It's if you go towards colder that you kill people. After all, why is it that 90% of all species on Earth live in the warm tropics?
Exactly.
And only 1%, it's actually less than 1%, live at the poles where it's cold.
Do
we really want to move towards colder weather? Of course, no rational person would want that.
We had World Alternative Media here. We're me and Josh Sigurdsson. We were actually from Manitoba in Canada, and it's very cold during winter time. We actually had for 4 years ago, we had the coldest place in the nearest universe. We had minus 52 degrees. So we know that it's
that's
we don't
fairly
like
severe.
cold.
The best we've managed on our estate in Scotland is minus 27, and that was a few years ago, and it was the coldest temperature ever recorded in mainland Britain. So the idea that you can't get cold weather in so-called global warming is, of course, wrong, but we should be very careful not to play their game. You get a hot day somewhere, they say, oh, this is proof of global warming. But if we say there's been a cold day somewhere, they say, well, that's not proof of anything. And actually, it isn't proof of anything if you get a single hot day or a single cold day. What matters is what is the long-term trend. The long-term trend is, over the last 50 or 60 years, is of a rate of global warming that is half of the central estimate predicted by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 1990, on the basis of a stated confidence, substantial confidence, they said, that the models they were using to make these predictions had captured all essential features of the climate. Well, plainly they hadn't, because the rate of global warming is half of what they then predicted as a central estimate, and indeed on none of the data sets, which vary quite a lot in how much warming they say has actually happened in a measured way since 1990, none of the data sets shows a rate of warming that is even above the lowest estimate of warming predicted by the IPCC in 1990. And this provides some verification that we are right, that you're not getting these very extreme responses of temperature. You are getting some. I would guess that some, I can't tell you how much, and nor, if they're honest, can anyone else, of the warming that's happened since 1950 or even 1990 was caused by us. We do not know. We do know that by the elementary theory of greenhouse gases, which is understood relatively well even down to the quantum level, we know which of the vibrational modes of CO2 is the one that interacts with outgoing radiation in the long wave, or indeed incoming radiation in the long wave. It doesn't matter which direction the radiation is going. And we know, therefore, that a quantum oscillation is established in the molecule when that interface happens, this excitation, de-excitation, collision. And we know that that excitation, that oscillation that happens, is by definition heat. It's like turning on lots of little radiators. If we put more CO2, we're putting more radiators into the atmosphere, and they will get turned on by these long-wave radiations, and they will emit heat, and the atmosphere will get warmer. The question is not whether there is such a thing as a greenhouse effect. There is. Get over it. Get used to it. The question is how much of a warming effect will that greenhouse effect have in the atmospheric column? And astonishingly, they've never measured this. They probably could nowadays, but they never have measured it.
Really?
And I think the reason why they haven't measured it, they know perfectly well that if they do, it's not going to give them the answer they want. And so we can say that even if they were right about the direct warming effect of CO2, which gives you your central estimate of how much warming you're going to get if you allow for some feedbacks on top, they are wrong about the upper and lower bounds, which come from the feedbacks, the uncertainty in the value of the feedbacks, because they're doing the feedback mathematics wrong, and they've been doing it wrong for 30 years. It's wrong in every IPCC report. It's wrong in paper after paper in the scientific literature. It's wrong in all the standard textbooks of atmospheric chemistry. I mean, it's amazing how many places this fundamental error appears. It is an error on which there is a consensus that we should do it wrong. And we can now show that they have done it wrong if we're right. Because, you see, on our side of this debate, we are skeptics. We are as skeptical of our own results as we are of anybody else's.
Yeah, which is a good way to be.
I won't be happy that we're right about this until the other side has had the chance to attack it. And they will attack it whether it's right or wrong. They always do, because they're not interested in the truth. But I will be able to watch the manner in which they attack it and determine whether they have a genuine ground for attacking it or not. I'll give you an example. We published a paper in the Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences in January of 2015. And this paper was simply setting up a simple model of the climate, which was essentially a single equation devised by me, which would be able faithfully to reproduce the official values of climate sensitivity. You plugged in the values they were using for the input variables. It would act just as though it were a big, complicated model, but it would give you the right answer, just with a single, simple equation. It rather horrified the climatological community that this could be done, but it can, and we showed it. And the reason why we did that was we wanted people to see why the models were running hot, and in particular, we wanted to raise this question of this strange hyperbolic feedback curve and the odd results that they were getting, and which were inconsistent with the way this curve works. And so we raised all these questions last year, and there was an enormous battle to get it into the journal, because all the lefties who were reviewing it said, we can't have this, it's questioning. One of the reviewers actually wrote, we can't publish this because it questions the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And he didn't say it's wrong to question it because they've got the science right and you've got it wrong, and here's why. He didn't do that. He just said they've dared to question the party line. It was as pathetic as that. And the editor said, well, of course we cannot possibly publish the paper. The reviewer has rejected it. And there are other two reviewers. One of them said it was wonderful, and the other said there were lots of niggling details he wanted to put right, which we put right. But this third reviewer, I wrote to the editors rather angry, and I said, look, you're a scientific journal, and it's not good enough for them just to say, well, this doesn't accord with the party line, and therefore it must be wrong. Where's the science? And the guy immediately capitulated. He said, well, actually, the paper is perfectly correct, but I don't like the result. And that's how they are. And of course, therefore, you can tell from that reaction that I wasn't going to take very seriously his criticism of the paper, because he didn't have a scientific criticism of it. And then there were a group of climate campaigners, including this chap who dresses up in fascist uniform who did the bogus 97%. So they got together and they wrote a silly paper trying to rebut our paper. And the Chinese Science Bulletin published it with great glee. And then we said, well, we want to reply to that. So they let us reply to it. And we knocked it 6 ways from Sunday because they just didn't know any climate science, these people.
Wow.
All they knew was the party line. And all they really said throughout their paper was, this paper by Monckton and his colleagues does not accord with the party line. It was a pathetic attempt at a rebuttal of us. So we then produced our own properly scientific paper saying, look, here we are with this single simple equation, and in just about every circumstance this equation will give a result which is closer to what is actually observed than the big fancy computer models will. Why? Because we don't have all the complications they have. We're looking only at the specific variables we need to look at to see how the temperature will change as a result of this particular CO2 enhancement. And therefore we can get it right, where they're trying to do all sorts of other things at the same time. And so they don't focus on CO2. And of course they incorporate this error. So we think that what will happen is there will be very strong attacks on this paper, first at the review stage, before publication, where they will try their damnedest to stop it being published. But the Chinese Science Bulletin, they were very fair-minded with us last time. They only were willing to listen to those reviews of our paper which were based on science, not just based on what's the party line. And so if they do the same again, if they have the courage to face down their own leadership now, which has begun to adopt this pro-climate change nonsense position, then if they're willing to do that, which is a bit of a stretch, but if they are, then they will say to the reviewers, no, it's no good just saying this paper is inconsistent with the party line and therefore must be wrong. You have to show why Monckton and co. are wrong scientifically, and if you can't, we'll publish his paper. We're hoping that's what they'll do, and we're hoping that we're right and that there isn't in fact any major error in our own paper. There could be. As I say, I am a layman. I can't claim to be an expert on every aspect of this. But so far, the experts we've gone to, and they are very powerful experts, and they have experience in this field, and we have an electronics engineer as one of our co-authors. They have all said we've got this right. So there's a stateable case that we're right. If we are, then if there were any rationality in this debate, and there isn't much, then that would be the end of the climate scare. It's over, and I declare it finished.
Well, that is a strong word there, Monckton. I want to go back to since we're talking about that might be the end of it. What do you think about guys like Donald Trump being actually is outspoken against the climate change movement? Do you actually hope or think that he could pull away from the Agenda 2030?
Perhaps the best appointment that he has made to date, and I've been following every appointment with fascination and mostly with delight, and particular delight, he's appointed Myron Ebell from the Competitive Enterprise Institute as the new head of the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, the EPA must be wetting themselves because Myron understands what total rubbish this global warming storyline is. And he will simply undo and stop and defund all programs to do with global warming because they are unnecessary. And of course our paper will come along at just about the right time. If the Chinese get their act together, we could actually be published by January the 20th. I think it would be a bit of a stretch to get it done that quickly, but it's possible. In which case we can put that paper straight on his desk and say, just use this, just give this to the people inside the EPA who say that you're wrong, and let them tell you where this paper is wrong. And that's basically the end of it then. That gives the Trump campaign the ammunition at the scientific level that it needs. And I'm hoping that Will Happer will now publish his result as a scientific paper, which he hasn't done yet, possibly in the same edition of the Science Bulletin. And if he does, I will also then be able to do some economic calculations using my economic model, which is not one of these vague, woolly, integrated assessment models that all the fancy economists use.
100%.
It is a model which targets the actual equations that they use to determine climate sensitivity, amended in the light of the errors that we and Will Happer quite separately. He's found a separate error. We put those together. I can then recalculate what I did 3 years ago and publish a new paper, perhaps even in the same issue of the Science Bulletin, saying, right, chaps, even if they were right about the amount of warming and they'd got the science right, it's still 10 to 100 times more expensive to mitigate today than to adapt in 100 years' time. But if you then get the science right, it's 100 to 1,000 times more expensive to act on global warming today than to let it happen and adapt. Because there will be some, but it won't be a lot.
No, the climate always changes.
And you have to take into account the benefits of adding CO2 to the atmosphere. You can see plant life all around us here.
Yeah.
All of it is growing more luxuriantly and faster, and in this desert climate here in Phoenix, Arizona, it will grow with less water. If you have more CO2 in the atmosphere, it's one of the points that Will Happer researched, then the stomata, the mouths, little mouths, on the underside of the leaves of plants, which breathe in the CO2 and give out oxygen in return, they become fewer in number as the CO2 concentration increases, because they don't need so many mouths to gasp it in. We're still in an era, so Patrick Moore says, and he's quite right, of course, of CO2 starvation as far as plants and trees are concerned. If you really were green, if you really wanted to green the planet, you would double or even triple the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. As our figures show, that won't make that much difference to global temperature, but it'll make a lot of difference to the luxuriance of plants. Indeed, you can measure from space using a rather clever device called a microwave sounding unit. You can actually measure how green the planet is becoming. And in the 30, nearly 40 years since we've had satellites up there, the amount of green living biomass on this planet, even after all the deforestations and clearances and so on, has actually increased by somewhere between 15 and 30%. And the only reason for this is CO2 fertilization. It is the extra CO2 in the air that is ending this long period of CO2 starvation. Absolutely. It's what they feed on. It's plant food. And so this side of things, again, you never hear this in the mainstream media, but this is, again, established scientific fact. They've done tests of putting the same plant in different CO2 regimes and watching the rates at which these plants grow, and you get a much more luxuriant growth if you've got 1,000 parts per million CO2 than the paltry 400 we have at the moment. And most of these plants evolved at a time when there was 1 to 2 or even 5,000 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. The planet didn't fry then. They loved it, and they'd love it just as much now if we put more CO2 back into the atmosphere. We'll also be staving off the next ice age. You know, we will get one. We're already, I think, 5,000 years overdue for one, so it's only a matter of time. I can't therefore tell you it's going to happen next week. What I can say is that because we've put some CO2 in the atmosphere, that may act as a barrier to allow us to reach out and get ourselves onto other planets before the next ice age comes here, because when the next ice age comes here, as things now stand, it will kill perhaps 3/4 of the planet's population. And these are considerations which you never see mentioned in the various economic assessments of this, and you should. It's very necessary.
It's our livelihood.
And I co-wrote a paper with Patrick Moore recently on this, and we showed there was a continuous decline in CO2 concentration over the last 140 million years. It's been a relentless decline. It jiggles up and down a bit, but the overall trend is downward. And if we had allowed another 2 million years to pass, at the rate of downward decline that we've seen over the last 140 million years, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere would have declined to below the amount at which plants and trees could survive, and everything would die.
Well, that is pretty dangerous for anything on Earth. And as you said, we also need to understand, like, what can we do to, survive? Like, we as human beings always have wanted to survive, no matter...
Well, the first step has already been taken. We've put a nice little blanket of CO2 into the atmosphere. That is already keeping us a little bit warmer than we would otherwise be. That means that the rate at which species are being created will increase, because it's in warmer and wetter weather that species develop, and not in the colder and drier weather on the whole. There are exceptions, but 90% of the species, we were saying earlier,
Yeah.
come from the tropics and only 1% from the poles. So, of course, the warmer weather we're getting is almost certainly creating more species as we speak than man, by its encroachment, by our encroachment onto the habitats of rare species, is killing off.
Yeah.
Now, that is not to say that, therefore, let's go on killing them off. I'm not advocating that we ignore all environmental considerations.
No.
My main point is that you have to concentrate on those environmental considerations that are real and pressing and immediate. And I start with my Holocaust every 6 months of human beings who are being killed because they don't have electricity. Then you can look at things like the encroachment of farmland onto forest. You can look at the encroachment of humans into areas where the rare gorillas and tigers and lions and so forth exist and are being threatened with extinction. Some of them, I'm afraid, will become extinct, as the Yangtze dolphin already has, because of the interference with their habitat by building of dams on the Yangtze River. All of these things are real environmental problems, which with quite a small expenditure of time, effort, thought and money we can address, so as to preserve the habitats of those delightful creatures that the good Lord allows to coexist with us on this planet. We've all come a long way in the evolutionary process, and the fact that they have survived as we have means that we do have a duty to them not to elbow them out in the way that, for instance, the North American parrot was extinguished by the first American settlers. It was a horrifying massacre, quite unnecessary. And this kind of thing we mustn't do again. We are aware now, thanks to the likes of Patrick Moore, the genuine environmentalists, we are aware of the real environmental dangers to this planet that we pose, and we are increasingly able to take the responsibility to deal with those. And that's where our effort should be going. And we should not divert, in the name of environmentalism, funds to non-problems. And I'm going to call climate change what it is, a non-problem. A little bit of warming is not a dangerous thing. It's a far better thing than a little bit of colder weather, and that there is at the moment, and this would continue to be the case for quite some time to come, there is a net economic and environmental benefit from increased emission of CO2 and increased concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and consequently of some, and it will be modest, increased global warming. It is a net benefit to humanity. That's what my original calculations showed, and now that we've identified this error, we can now say with still more confidence that there is a net benefit, and it is even larger than I had originally calculated. And so once we can get the world's scientists and the world's governments, like Mr. Trump, to face the fact that the bullshit merchants, the sophists of our day, have got it wrong. And there was no consensus among them anyway, but they got it wrong. The politicians who pressed this got it wrong. The scientists who pressed it got it wrong. The press, the media, who have only printed one side of the story, they got it wrong. They're all going to have to eat crow once our paper comes out. They got it wrong. The scare is over.
So what is your message then to Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada that are pushing a national carbon tax in Canada? And
the reason why left-wing politicians are doing this, and of course I've been following what Trudeau has been doing, these damn fool windmills all over Ontario and so on, of course, which are enormously environmentally destructive. They kill birds and bats by the million. Nobody cares, of course, because the left say it's all wonderful. Well, no, it isn't wonderful. But the reason why the fascist and communist left, and I include Trudeau in that category,
I agree,
are so mesmerised by this global warming thing is partly it's this atavistic desire to destroy capitalism that came from Russian communism, to which many of them privately subscribe, whatever they may say in public. They are essentially communists or fascists or both.
Well, we've seen that with Trudeau, saying how great Fidel Castro was.
There you are. I mean, a very nice example.
He just exposed
that
himself.
man killed millions, and to hear this idiot. I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
No,
to call the Prime Minister an idiot,
I
but really,
couldn't say it better myself.
He's a small boy who has been taught the party line and knows nothing else, as in he's incapable of rational thought. But he's good looking, and the women all voted for him, as far as I can tell. I mean, it's just absurd. So the message to President Trump is do not be diverted by the Democrats coming along and wheedling and cajoling you and saying, why can't we have a bipartisan approach on this terrible problem the planet faces? The fact is the planet doesn't face any kind of a terrible problem from climate change. It is suffering at the moment a terrible problem from the measures intended, however piously, to make climate change that isn't happening go away.
Yeah.
And this Holocaust every 6 months, that is the thing which every politician with a conscience is now going to have to face. One of the things I'm looking at is, can we persuade the International Criminal Court that the willful negligence of world leaders like Trudeau on this question, so that they deny to the third world countries the electricity that we could so easily make sure they were provided with. Does that constitute genocide? Does it constitute a crime against humanity, not by the crushing jackboot, but by the still more crushing jackboot of indifference, of looking the other way while your fellow citizens are killed because they don't have the electricity you have?
Yeah.
Looking the other way and then kicking those poor people in the teeth by saying they can't be allowed electricity because climate change would otherwise destroy the planet. This is nonsense. Most of them either know it's nonsense or they don't know whether it's nonsense or not, but they still say it's true. And that, as we said earlier, is just as much a fraud and therefore just as much a genocide as if they had gone with a jackpot and kicked these people until they died. One has to understand that now in this global village we have responsibilities to those whom our policies through indifference are killing. And it's not our policies, of course, it's the policies of the communist and fascist left, the Trudeaus of this world, the Obamas of this world, who do not care how many people they kill as long as they destroy America, as long as they destroy Western capitalism.
Exactly.
And we have to face them down, as Trump has done during the campaign. He called them every name in the book, and the working classes cheered him to the echo, because they know. You go to the miners of West Virginia. I had the honour of addressing the miners. To me, have always been the absolute heroes of labour. No amount of money would induce me to go down a deep mine as they do in West Virginia, and I did do it in Yorkshire, and I got out of there as soon as I could. It was terrible. You go down these mines. The dust is awful. There's no daylight. It's really dangerous. And these are the heroes of labour. And in West Virginia, of course, their businesses are being destroyed by Obama's war on coal. Yeah. And this war on coal has nothing to do with the climate and everything to do with the fact that the big coal owners were the big donors to his political opponents in the Republican Party. That is all that this is about. It's all because the American Democrats want to run the Republicans out of funds by killing off the coal industry. That's what this is all about. And I had the privilege of speaking about 5 or 6 years ago to 100,000 mine workers and their families and friends gathered on a mountaintop in West Virginia.
Oh, wow.
I had to be flown in by helicopter because the roads in all directions were blocked by people wanting to get to this rally. And I had the honour of being the keynote speaker, and I said, look, actually, you don't have to worry that there is a need to close your industry down because of climate change. There isn't. There is a need to enlarge and extend your industry so that coal-fired power can be given to the rest of the world that needs it just as desperately as we do. And they cheered me to the echo. It was a wonderful meeting. I went to the US Senate a week later to talk to some friends there. All the senators were enormously jealous because they'd never spoken to a live audience of 100,000 before. But there is, among the working people in the West now, an understanding that the left do not represent their interests and actually never have. This sea change, which we saw in the Brexit vote in Britain, and we saw it in the election of Donald Trump against all the odds and all the posters here in the United States.
And we have Italy coming up too.
We'll see what happens there. We'll see what happens in France. All of these countries, they are moving towards what used to be known as the far right. Actually, of course, it's the centre right. It's where the working classes are saying, why should we allow these globalizing international socialist, communist, fascists any longer to interfere with our chance to make a good and secure living in our own countries?
That's all that it is
about. Trump, with brilliant strategy, devised, I'm quite sure, by Steve Bannon, who has at least 2 horns and a tail. He's his wonderful head of strategy, who you used to be the chief executive of Breitbart. And I had the pleasure of meeting Steve in Washington 6 months ago and had a long talk with him. He came and had dinner with me. And fascinating man, very, very, very clear thinking,
Must be
hard
quite
hitting.
scary for the West, no, for the left.
I think they're very frightened now because they hadn't realised how out of touch they had become, because all the media, practically, apart from Fox, all wall-to-wall Marxist. And the echo chamber of Washington, 93% of Washington, D.C., voted for Hillary Clinton. Only 4% voted for Trump. That's how out of touch they are with the fact that the country at large is much more evenly divided than they are. And the governing class in Washington does not any longer represent the people.
No, they're so
and
out of
Trump
touch.
is going to have to clean it out. And he said he's going to drain the swamp. Whether he really will, we will see.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of what he says, I think, is going to prove to be rodomontade. But we can hope, because he sees the point.
There might be some good people now that are coming in there that could...
Well, he's made some very good advice. So Myron Ebell, as head of the EPA, wonderful. The only thing he's going to need is somebody at his elbow to tell him how to shut this monstrous machine down. And I shall be helping a bit from the sidelines on that.
That's
because
good to hear.
He hasn't had that kind of executive experience. I have. Of course, some of the other members of the cabinet do have that sort of experience. It is an unusually competent lot of people that he's chosen. And what is interesting about that is the way that left-wing media respond that, this is the wealthiest cabinet in American history. Well, of course it is. America is a wealthy country. But that's not the point.
No.
The point is, it's the most competent cabinet in American history. It's the best qualified cabinet in American history. That's what they should be saying if they were honest. They could say also that they're wealthy, but they're wealthy, most of them, because they're competent, not because they're lucky.
No, they have they're part of what's called the free market, that they actually had ideas and they had knowledge that made them wealthy.
Well, that's the thing. They not only had knowledge, but they had the skill.
Yeah.
They knew in particular how to pick people to run their businesses who knew what they were doing. And it's this business of dealing with people is the biggest skill in business. They don't really teach it in business school, but that's the biggest skill. And Trump, whatever you may say about him, like him or loathe him, he has that capacity. And we're seeing it in his picks. We're seeing it in the fact that even Mitt Romney will have dinner with him and eat frog's legs with him in a swank Washington D.C. restaurant. This guy is building he's rejuvenating the Republican Party by getting even his fiercest critics and opponents, even the ones he called the most appalling names during the campaign. He's getting them alongside him. And this is a very important reanimation, remagnetization of the Republican Party to give it a purpose and to get rid of the flab and get it actually to have an idea of what it's going to do. What is very impressive watching the transition team turning into a government is that a lot of planning had already gone in over the last year, even though he didn't know he was going to win. A lot of homework had been done on what he was going to do, how he was going to do it. And thanks to Mike Pence, who is a terrific pick for vice president, very hard-working, he's really getting on with making sure that the agenda for the first few days, for the first 100 days, for the first 200 days, they hit the ground running and they start doing things. They've got this precious majority, which of course is only a heartbeat away from extinction in the Senate, so they've got to act immediately, and they're going to. And this sense of purpose and organization and business-like approach, which was totally foreign to Obama, who didn't know what he was doing.
Well, very many people in government doesn't have
no,
any
they're
business
usually
experience.
inept in the extreme. And now we have a cabinet of all the talents, and they really are talents. These are people who know how to run things. The only question mark that I, as an old-fashioned politician, would have, and this would apply to Trump himself and to some of his picks, is that they've had no political experience before, and it is therefore very easy for astute politicians to talk them out of their original intentions. And one of the things that Steve Bannon said to me when I knew he was going to go to the campaign was that he was going to let Trump be Trump. And he's going to have to go on letting Trump be Trump. He's got to let Trump make sure that he doesn't get diverted by the whispers of the left trying to wheedle him. And the left do this a lot. And in the climate debate, in the early stages, during the debate on cap and trade, they were always coming even to me and saying, look, can't we have a bipartisan approach on the common understanding that this is a real problem? I said, but it isn't a real problem. There cannot be any understanding between those who wish to destroy capitalism in America and wish to destroy the industries whose directors were the biggest donors to the Republican Party, and that's what you're doing here. And they would go red when I said it because they knew it was true. And on the other hand, those of us who've actually studied the science and know perfectly well that there is no problem. It is an opportunity and a benefit that we're going to get from warmer weather and more CO2 in the atmosphere. There is no common ground if you persist going down your road of denying the true science. And they didn't like that at all because they knew the party line. This is the thing about the left now. They no longer exercise reason at all. It's all about what does the party line say? Right, I know I'm safe, I know I'll get promotion and keep my job if all I do is parrot the party line and never question it.
Yeah.
That's how the left think. And on the centre-right, why we keep beating them, even though we're not as well organised as they, we're not as well funded as they, is because they have the money, the power and the glory, but we have the truth.
Yeah,
and they don't understand that.
The truth always prevails.
Yes, as one of the apocryphal Gospels puts it, magna est veritas et prevalet. Great is truth and mighty above all things.
And I think we'll end it on that, Mr. Monckton. I just want to say how much we appreciate you coming on World Alternative Media. This is John Sneisen signing out for World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.